Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Business Storytelling. Tonight, it's not storytelling per se, though, because my guest tonight is Paul Costello, founder and executive director of Storywise. Paul is a pioneer in narrative theory and, dare I say, a narrative practitioner more than a storyteller, a person who learned from Michael White himself, and founder of many projects all around the world that just make the world a better place, like the New Story Leadership Program for, just imagine it, young Palestinian and Israeli students that bring and build bridges between the countries, which is inspiring. So, Paul, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Thank you. So I will start with a traditional question, but instead of asking how you got to be a storyteller, I would say, to be more precise, how have you come to be a narrative practitioner? Because that's what you are, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think the long and the short of it was that I was looking for a method. I have a background in ministry, so I guess I would have come to it originally through the theological studies and scriptural studies and the power of religious stories and religious myths. But I was running a program on the streets of the Gold Coast in Australia, where we were working with Indigenous and homeless people on the streets in a place called Surfers Paradise on the Gold Coast in Queensland. And my young volunteers were encountering people where there was possibly one chance. If these people were homeless or addicted or whatever, you had one chance to have an impact. And I was in search of a method or a tool or a way in which that one chance, that one shot could have more impact around how people tell you their story of victimhood and suffering and pain and need, and how you respond and listen to. And what I was discovering was that my young Christian volunteers were being very compassionate, being very caring, being very empathic, and at the same time getting sucked into that zone of victimhood and forking and giving money or giving aid, which wasn't helping the people in need. So I was looking for a way in which how stories are constructed, what is the victim story constructed to do, and how it doesn't necessarily help the victim themselves, that victims are victims of their own story. And so I discovered Michael White in Adelaide, and I went for some intense training in, I think it was 1990, and it just blew me away to see what Michael was doing with the power of stories in the context of family therapy. So, I mean, that's how it started as a very practical thing. But then I got a chance to do a lot of postgraduate research in American University in Washington and set up the training institute here. That's about 25 years ago. But that's where it started. It was a very practical, it wasn't out of theory. I had homeless people on the street and I had 15 minutes to listen to their story in a way that would not deepen them in that victim prison. And how could I do that?
Wow, I like hearing this. When you said this phrase with the victims suffering from their victim story, like this story sucking them in, I immediately hear the voice of my wife saying, like, "Oh, now that's a practitioner of narrative. Like, that's not a storytelling type. That's
right.
Deep." Wow. So I know that you've been practicing for quite a while, and you've done a lot of projects. So let me just start by asking you this broad question that will launch it, kind of. So maybe there are some fundamental things about stories that, have been there all along and haven't changed, and even maybe only amplified since you began your practice.
Well, we set up a training institute called the Center for Narrative Studies, and its handle was Storywise, and it's storywise.com still to this day. I think we started that in 1998, so it's been around a while. But we used to say the three things that we would realize that 22 years ago we put it out there, and I would still say it today, that hasn't changed. For people to understand the power of stories, that stories have real power, and people don't often think about stories in context of power, that that the power that stories have, and it's a term Michael White uses, has real effects. Stories have real effects on identity and on destiny and on community, like who we are, who are our people, and where are we going. So stories have enormous, even if they're not true, stories have real effects that you can measure and you can see evidence of. And then if you know that stories are powerful, and if you know that they have real effects that shape our lives and our nation and our family, then you can intervene and you can affect change more. You can get inside that system and do something to change it around issues of conflict or healing or reconciliation or whatever around. So that were the three things. And our little summary was, Storywise means shaping the stories that are shaping us. And that's how we, and you know what, that's 25 years old. And I'd have to say it's as fresh and as vibrant for us today as it was 25 years ago. I still believe that. I believe it actually even more. The power of stories that we're evident, it's around us in Washington, D.C. in 2020 with an election coming up in 6 weeks. The power of story to shape the conversation and the way the country sees itself. We've only, I only thought of, now I see that I was only, I only half understood what I meant when I said stories have power. Now I kind of see, my God, I didn't even know what that totally meant until I sort of see what's going on around us now.
That's interesting. I would want to discover a bit more of this, the new reality. Like, what do you mean by this new feeling of power in stories?
Well, I think a lot of and a lot of your colleagues who come to this, are story performers, and they tell the stories, and they know this. They can go to a crowd of 150 people and in 5 minutes have them crying. I mean, I think a storyteller knows instinctively, and that's why they do it. It's such a transformative experience, right? But if you take a step back and just say, if you've seen evidence of that power of a story to change people's hearts and minds in the moment, imagine if $10 billion was being spent to create structures, platforms of broadcasting, content creation and development. If $10 billion was spent using that same insight to get at us, Mr. Citizen or Mrs. Citizen, to do certain things, to buy certain products, to vote for certain candidates, to believe certain myths or lies about things, then you realize it's a question of power. And then it's a question of freedom. And then it becomes a question of, it's what Abraham Lincoln said in 1862 with the Civil War. He said, the new birth of freedom was about disenthralling ourselves. So Lincoln had this notion that freedom wasn't just external and slavery, that our minds, I mean, the territory between this ear and this ear is the territory that's been captured. What can we do to, the act of liberation is around stories, and it's around how we think and how we imagine.
Beautiful. So it's like the world is, it's way easier to get captured these days because way more attention is spent by the ones in power into capturing the people. Yeah, but just a question that popped up in my mind. Like I'm just thinking that if so many power is spent to influence the people, to buy stuff, to vote for people, and etc., maybe there are some ways to educate yourself in a story, to get back, to get yourself.
I mean, I think that's what really Storywise has come to mean, that like wise up, that someone, and that to develop a stronger sort of muscle of skepticism, if you like. It's almost like I've come to the conclusion recently that to protect myself as a citizen, I'm going to presume that they're all lies. I'm not going to, normally in a culture that builds trust, we presume truth. But I think it's been such a tortured 3 years around saying, well, everyone's getting at me. the tobacco industry lied for 30 years to say that it didn't cause cancer. The health industry is paying lobbyists millions and millions of dollars to lie about which is the best healthcare system. So I think part of it's wising up to realize that this is about power, and to always talk about story in the context of power. And then you realize whose power and which stories serve me and my power to determine, to choose, to decide, to make meaning, or is someone doing it for me? So I guess it means I want people to get suspicious that we're carrying stories that somebody else's purposes are being served by, and they're not, even though we may think they're serving our purpose. If we get in, Michael White had this thing about externalizing, get outside your story. So that's where I've kind of moved into my work about mapping. So that if meaning moves, it's not the moment, it's the momentum that I'm worried about. People are measuring the moment. I want to measure the momentum. I want to know which direction. And it's not just the story I'm telling today, but the pattern of story making. And that I get to see that from a satellite. You get to see. The last week, Artem, you and I, we could sort of catch ourselves. What kind of stories are we telling in the last week? If we catch ourselves and say, what stories are we, how are we habitually making meaning, and is it serving us? And if it's not, which means I think people who are in the victim story don't kind of understand sometimes that they're re-victimizing themselves.
Yeah.
Because a victim story is always telling about the power of somebody else and not my power.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, which means then that I'm less interested, I tell stories, but I'm much more interested in a critical analysis to say, whose story is it? Why are you telling it? Where did it come from? Whose purposes is it serving? And if it's not really serving your purpose, why are you telling it? And what's the story that serves your purpose, that honors your agency to create your own meaning in the world?
That's very deep, and honestly, I'm trying to catch myself understanding these all terms, because it's not that you make it complicated, you make it clear, but I feel that it's more about comprehending with the story. It's not about talking the story out. It's about stepping aside, viewing it, and even stepping upwards and viewing it from the top. Yeah.
Right.
Maybe I know that it's a whole different approach, really, and I'm trying to grasp it, but maybe there are some steps, or a first step you can take to take the higher ground, to look at the story as a perspective, to see the momentum. I know that it comes through mastery, but maybe some advice.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we would be teaching is a certain. All right, so I mean, I would tell you a story, and then look at it as a distinct unit of meaning making, and get outside of it, and then apply certain maps, certain critical maps, for example, so one of the basic ones is beginning, middle, and end, the axis of coherency, which is what we call what Aristotle said is what makes a story feel whole. I tell you a story, and then you interrogate the story in a way. Is it a beginning story? Is it a middle story? Is it an end story? And each of them have different energies, and each of them have different possibilities. And so so the story that America's telling right now, we've got a 74-year-old candidate, a 74-year-old president, and a 77-year-old candidate. So where are they? They're at the end of their life. We've got two grandfathers running for office.
Yeah.
So what kind of energy can we expect? Is this going to be like an Obama election? It can't possibly be, because we've got two candidates who are grandparents, and this is their final shot. They're not going to have another go at it being president. That's a different energy field that they can create, and an energy field that they cannot possibly create, because that's where they are. And then where's the country now? It's 20 years into the 21st century. So like, you know, it's not bright and breezy new to a new millennium anymore. We're 20 years in. We're still recovering from 9/11. We're still recovering from the wars. We're still recovering from terrorism. We're tired. We're tired. So the principle that it frees me up. One of the externalizing things is it's not, the story isn't saying something about you. It's saying something about where you are.
Interesting. So there is a beginning, middle to an end to every story, and every story is itself in the beginning or a middle of a life, or, you know.
Right.
Wow. That's good. I'd never thought about it.
That brings some analytical tools to say, like, to help you get out, you know, like a doctor, you go to the doctor and you've got a cold and a temperature. The doctor just interprets that on a template to say, oh, you've got the flu.
Yeah.
So someone tells you the story that this is the most important election in American history, and you just hear that as, oh, that's the election story. We hear that every 4 years. And then the stories that are created to create fear, or the stories that are told to create the promise of the future. So now, and it's just interesting, applying that to the election, the conversation right now isn't about immigration reform. The conversation right now is about health reform, as in it's under threat because of the Supreme Court. But there's no big vision. There's no bold vision. President Trump isn't saying he's not bold new programs, it's just stick with me. Biden is just saying, let's get back to normal. So guess what's not in the conversation? The future's not in the conversation. Isn't that incredible? Isn't this incredible? With Obama in 2008, the future was very much the conversation. So then I've got some, the beginning, middle, and end is one set of tools. And there's a whole lot of other tools like that.
Wow.
That empower me so I don't get sucked in. It's like, I've seen it all before. I know how to bring a critical analysis to this that empowers me. Wow. And just says, you know, they're not going to suck me in. I've seen this all before. You know. That
is so interesting. Let me share, because I recently had a talk in a bank where they have a festival of knowledge, and several trainers were up there speaking about their themes. And I was speaking on storytelling and business as a persuasion tool, which is like one of the usages, really more basic than the stuff we're discussing right now. But ahead of me was a guy who is a very famous business trainer in Russia. He was talking about critical thinking. And I was like, okay, he is showing that critical thinking is in top 3 of the skill sets for 2020. Like it's top 3 skill sets. And I'm like, okay, I know how to tie stories to communication, to team management. And you're just now gave me the insight of how to tie stories to critical thinking and analysis. It's not the story. It's this view on the story. Wow, this is such an insight. Thank you so much.
We've got to step 1 back or 2 back from our own practice and be self-critical. Yeah. You know, otherwise we're fooling ourselves. And I think that's the secret. Like, if I want to sell you a car that's not worth $5, but I want you to pay $5,000 for it, I can bring all the set of persuasive skills to get you to buy this car, because I've picked your weakness. You know, I know you have a weakness for a red convertible, and this is a red convertible. It's a piece of shit. It's a piece of crap. But I know that that's your weakness. So part of empowering myself is what I call, in the book, it's called narrative vulnerabilities. I've got to know what my narrative vulnerabilities are as a person, and as a people, a community, and as a nation. You know, because otherwise I'll get sucked in, because people suck me into lies because I want to believe them as true. I want to believe them. And if people know that vulnerability, then I'm open to all sorts of exploitation without even knowing it.
But when you're conscious about it, it's way harder for you to fall into them.
Absolutely. I use the example, if you grew up in a religious cult, and then at 15 you had a breakdown and you realized that it was all just a manipulation, and you left it all behind. someone knocks on your door and tries to convince you to join some religious cult, you'll slam the door in their face because you've been there, done that. You're not narratively vulnerable to that because you've suffered enough and you've wised up to that. But there's other parts of our lives where we're always, the people, you know, we always dream we're going to win the lottery, or we always wanted a boat. There's certain, our capitalist system particularly exploits those unfulfilled fantasies, and what it's selling us is dreams. It's not selling us products. If $10 billion is now coming at you and me between now and November the 3rd to make us think a certain way and feel a certain way, how do you combat that? How do you possibly resist that? $10 billion. It's like, therefore, we've got to develop tools of narrative literacy and narrative critical thinking, because the way they're doing it is through stories. They're doing it through stories. They know what we know.
Yeah.
But they're weaponized it.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. That's the first time you've actually mentioned the metaphor of war, and it's about the things they do. You know what, Paul? It's honestly the things that you say about stories is like there is a certain, I feel it, there is a certain level of mastery which people reach, like you and Mary Alice Arthur and David Hutchins. Like it's when stories become not a method but a philosophy, or like, you know, something bigger, something brighter. It's awesome. And maybe you know what, let me ask you this question. Can you share with me some of the lessons learned that you've learned on the road to this perception? Maybe some, you know, hard moments that, you know, made it appear to you, this knowledge.
Well, another map, and let me introduce it by giving you another map that you know, I know you find, I'm sure you find this, you know, it's like a Jewish joke. You get 5 storytellers in a room and you'll get 50 versions of what a story is. We have totally different views, you see. But to me, the working function of how I understand a story is it has to have 3 things. It has to have characters, it has to have plot, and it has to have audience. Now, most people don't put audience in there, but audience is the make or break. So for example, Israel-Palestine. I work with Israel-Palestine, and I started that a dozen years ago. And what I didn't quite realize is I was fitting into the American liberal, Jewish liberal, Christian liberal audience, that they wanted peace, and they wanted Israelis and Palestinians to come together. And this contact theory of Gordon Allport is, all you've got to do is get enemies to know each other and like each other and become friends, and that's how you solve your problem, right? And it worked with France and Germany after World War II, so surely it can work with Israel and Palestine. And then I realized that was creating a story that served the audience of American liberals who love to think that. But after Obama's failed peace attempts, failed once, failed twice, failed third time, and then you've got, say, you know, you've got Trump, not only failing, but giving away half the sort of the real estate, and then realizing that's a whole history that starts back to 1967, and then just realize this is a story told for the audience. It's not told for the reality, because if Palestinians to come on our program has to risk being assassinated because they're seen to be with Israelis, and there's us. And I'm an Australian, but we're Americans. This is lovely, wonderful. Let's get them together, without realizing a Palestinian to come on my program faces death. But it's so wonderful that they come together in Washington, but he's facing death. And then some of them can't go back, or some of them do go back and they get imprisoned. So but no, it's wonderful. So America's living in the romance story. Everything's going to be fine. All we've just got to do is bring these people together. And that's the model of most programs, even today. And they're living tragedy. They're living tragedy. So you've got total mismatch. So I would realize after 12 years of that work, my narrative analysis would say, Paul, you've made some calculations there dictated by the audience and what the audience needs, not by what the students need. And therefore, you've got to get much more ruthless and much more practical to say, that doesn't work. In fact, we're feeding a delusion that Israelis and Palestinians can live together in Washington, when they go home, the Palestinians will be imprisoned or executed, and the Israelis, if they're liberal Israelis, my God, there's probably about 3 of them left in Israel right now. And when they go back, they're shunned. they're going to lose, they're not going to get career opportunities because they're seen as traitors. So the American romantic illusion that somehow as an empire imposes its point of view on the world, if we think we're doing good, we must be doing good. Well, that's just sort of not the way it works. So character, plot, and audience, that how many stories are captive of what the audience needs and have nothing to do with reality. Nothing to do with reality. Whereas in the Irish program, one of my graduates just stepped down as the Prime Minister of Ireland. He was Prime Minister for 4 years. He's one of my graduates. So like in the Irish program, they were in a different position, Catholics and Protestants. But how can you run a program when the power differential between an occupied people and the second biggest army in the world or something? Like, that's delusional. And I look back and think, what was I thinking? What was I thinking? Stories are about power. Who gets to tell them and who doesn't? So, so if I was doing that program again, and I step back now to do some rethinking, but I would start a totally different program. That model, and I think if you want to, it's the romantic, I think, it's a typical of America's narrative vulnerability. Let's go into Iraq and let's Operation Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom. They're going to welcome us like they did in Paris in 1944. When we liberated Paris, they're going to welcome us. It's like the romantic imposition that this is the way the world works. And the world knows that's not the way the world works. But if you've got empire and power and you're stuck in a genre, you're stuck in that. Now, I think the crisis for America right now is the romantic genre is just fraying so much. It doesn't work anymore. We can't even fool ourselves anymore.
Wow, that's deep. So that's about these projects. But yeah, I know you're still running the New Story Leadership Program with the Palestinians and Israeli students, right?
Well, I've stepped back. I'm emeritus now, but I mean, the two people, there's a young Israeli woman and a young Palestinian woman who are my graduates who are running it. And, they're doing wonderful, amazing things. I've stepped back because, to me, the story, I'm doing a lot more work in Gaza and working with Gaza University. And, because of all there's the West Bank, there's Gaza, and there's Israel. That Gaza is probably the most unvoiced. It's part of the system that's just totally drowned out. So if you're going to affect change, it's like Frederick Douglass is somebody that I've been doing a lot more reading on. And Frederick Douglass is just saying, power doesn't change without a struggle. And so I think the power imbalance has got what's got to be worked on before there can be any really meaningful dialogue between two parties, It's a bit like Black consciousness, the Black power movement. It's just like, if one side is always here and one side is there, you can't pretend to have a dialogue or a negotiation or a reconciliation.
Yeah.
It's a delusion. It's a romantic fallacy. You've got to build power. And that's what my strategy now is. The Gazan people are so smart and so wonderful, but they've suffered the most. We've got to build them up and make sure that they've got some position of power to leverage change.
Interesting.
Otherwise they're victims,
Yeah. That's an interesting thing to think about, because wherever there is power, there is always an imbalance of power. And at the same time, we need to struggle to find the balance of power. It's it's a noble pursuit.
What we work is, the working assumption is those who have power don't want change, and those who want change don't have power. That's the working assumption. And so therefore, if you were and that power, the victim story is, see what you're doing to me, you have to be, how could you dare? Empathy and compassion, you must. And it's like, it's a wonderful, noble argument for change, but no oppressor, no dictator changes his mind because he's trying to be virtuous. Usually it's because he has to change or she has to change because there's something else at stake. So I think, power, it's like power distorts our lens of perception. And if you have it, there's a great book called The Power Paradox, which we would get our students, Israeli Palestinian students, to read. I forget the name of the author, but it is about the fact that the more power you have, the less you have to care, because you can rule by, by dictate. But how do you build power? It's like, it's not how you tell better stories, how you build power to have leverage. And stories are certainly part of it, but they're not the totality of it. And in fact, there's so much unlearning to be done, because some stories we tell do not empower us at all.
That's interesting. You know what? It's a bit depressing to hear that it's not about the stories, it's about the power, because the story is a power tool and a powerhouse. But I really got a feeling that the story is not enough, since the world has gone crazy and the $10 billion are coming but okay, let me ask you this question for, just to as a beginning of an end. Let me ask you this question. How can we navigate it? Like, apart from being a professional narrative practitioner and creating yourself a narrative lens, maybe there are some ways to navigate this crazy world.
I think there are, and I I think people like you and me and our colleagues have, just as a matter of our practice, developed a set of critical tools that I think we could work on and create a whole school of narrative literacy and narrative critical skills to help people defend themselves against this onslaught. But I think we're applying it a lot to business or to community or to organizational storytelling and stuff. And I think it's got to be applied to the culture, and it's got to be applied to the political culture. And the reason why I say that is because the people who are lobbyists and the people who are running these political campaigns, they know how to do it. I think we're a little bit naive sometimes. I just think we're siloed in our own little school, but in the real world, where it affects decisions about health and taxes and stuff, it's a ruthless application of narrative skill and narrative power that we've got to sort of, I guess, wake up to, and then work together to create a set of tools, maps, critical questions, teaching. We've got to teach people to not to succumb to this, and almost like take citizenship rights back, to say we have the power to make meaning about our own lives in our own way and in our own voice and in our own language. It doesn't always just have to be Coca-Cola. So that's it's a kind of an emancipation act. It's a declaration of independence, but then we've got to give people the tools to, how do you smell a story? If the military tell you they need more money for war because they're at threat because of Russia or China, be suspicious, because if a car salesman says he's got the best car for you, be suspicious. If a doctor's selling you a medicine, at $500 a pill, be suspicious. Like the agenda, it's almost like saying someone tells you a story, the first question is, what's the agenda here? And I think it also means that I think we've got to examine the story we're telling about story. I think we're evangelists for story, but I think we are romantic, telling a romantic story about story in a tragic world. And if you look at Syria, you look at Yemen, you look at the countries in the world, it's tragic, and like we're spreading the gospel of how beautiful stories are. Well, I don't know. To me, the story we're telling about story, it needs some critical rethinking, I believe.
That's a thing to think about in the evening. Well, okay, let me wrap up with a different question to, find some next steps, not maybe bright, but reassuring somehow.
Right.
What vision do you have, if you have one, for a story as a tool or as a philosophy for the future? Like right now, it's more of an influence tool and more of in some countries like Russia, it's a public speaking tool. But what does it have to become for us to build a better world for the others?
Well, you know, I think on the positive side, on the bright side, meaning that I think somehow or other, as human beings who use language, we all tell stories, and therefore innately we know how they work. A kid comes home from school and tells us why he's not doing the homework, and we immediately know that he's just covering up or something. I think we have an intuitive, innate understanding of how stories work and when we're being conned or whether we're being so. If the medium of power and the medium of oppression is this medium of story, and each and every one of us who uses language have some insight, then I think it's a matter of teaching and education and practice to take that unconscious competency we all have and make it a conscious competency around the skills, around, what kind of stories do you tell if you want to sell me something? What kind of stories do you want to if you want me to go and burn my neighbor's house down? What kind of stories do you need to tell me to create a war? What kind of stories do you need to tell me to create a possibility of reconciliation? What kind of stories do you need to tell to cure the healthcare system? If that's the medium, and we have then it's the social media can amplify it, but it's like I think every one of us have a lot more power than we're using. Have a lot more power and have a lot more insight to say that a story system depends upon audience, us. It needs us to keep believing. Once we suspend our belief and don't believe it anymore, or we see the game that we're being played, then we take back power. I mean, the President Trump phenomenon here and all the debates going on is because we are the audience. We have given them power. I feel sometimes everyone wants to blame President Trump as the character in the story, and it's like a melodrama. He's the bad guy or he's the good guy. I mean, it's kind of grade 1 level of narrative intelligence, and no one's owning up to the fact that enough people voted for him. A story needs an audience. Without an audience, it's dead. So we're the audience. Guess what? We just discovered that we're powerful. Wow. I now know I'm powerful and I don't have to be sucked in anymore. And if I discern and say, you know what, I'm not going to watch that TV show. I'm not going to buy that product. I'm not going to listen to that politician anymore. I just take the oxygen out of the room and the fire won't burn anymore. So I think at the heart of this is a revolutionary understanding that actually character, plot, and audience, stories rise or fall on audience. And I'm the audience. So I'm complicit. Aha. Then I can do something to change it. Yes, I can. Absolutely. So I think it's a rediscovery. Story invites me as an audience to rediscover my power because I'm complicit in everything that's going wrong. And if I tell a story of blame, I'm delusional. I'm the innocent one. No, I'm not. We got to this point in time because of choices we've all made. We've got to own that responsibility. But that's a good thing. Then I can change it. So I think at the end, it's a really positive message. It's a really revolutionary message. My son is making movies about Gaza because the way we're going to change Gaza is maybe protest, and that's fine. No. There's certain stories that the world needs to hear about Gaza, which will change their understanding of what's going on there, and that will bring about political change. So that's using story in a very strategic, informed way to create change.
It's interesting. You've got me thinking about the political side of it, like the stories we hear about, per se, Russian elections. It's always on when the elections are coming. There is always a bunch of videos of older people who are, incompetent in the ways of politics, and they're just saying, "Yeah, well, I'll vote for Putin." Why? Because that's the only reason. And this enhances the story of you're powerless. But if we are the audience, that gives me a way to think about it. Yeah,
right.
That's interesting.
Well, it just means I have this thing about attention and intention, which means, you map what are you paying attention to?
Yeah.
And then what is your intention? And if they disconnect, then then if your attention is not a function of your intention, it means you're paying attention to things that you really don't think matter. Then why are you doing that? So it's because that $10 billion is there to, it's not the extraction industry, which is mining and coal. It's the distraction industry, which is, I just want your attention. I want your eyeballs. And you spend up most of your day looking at things that aren't really important to you, but someone has hijacked your attention. So again, the liberation movement is to say, you know what? I'm going to examine my day tomorrow, and I'm just going to pay attention to the things that I intend and think matter. And I'm going to turn that TV off, because the art of storytelling is always the art of grabbing people's attention and having that attention serve my intention as a storyteller. Let me tell you about the 3 elephants in Northern Africa. Now, were you thinking about African elephants in Northern Africa a second ago? No. Is it important for you to think about them? No. But I'm gonna wow you and weave you and all these elephants, and you know, one of them was Russian actually. One of them was Russian from the same town as you, and I suck you in. And at the end of it, you're either buying the disc or buying the product. I have hijacked your attention to serve my intention, not yours. And your job would be as a resistor, as a rebellion or revolution, to say, I refuse. So in other words, we've got to teach people to resist story, not tell story. So I think, in summary, I think there's a revolution that us story practitioners can start, but I think we maybe aren't paying enough attention to the tragedy in the world because we're still selling ourselves. We're bought into a system where we have to make a living out of this. So we're selling it to business and whatever. But a global view would say climate change and everything else, to say, listen, we have the tools to change the world. Maybe we're too caught in a little story. Maybe we've got to go big. Maybe we've got to amplify our talent and our skills and change the world, not just help a business make more profit,
I would never assume that an interview with a story practitioner, a narrative practitioner, would end with do not practice a story, practice story resistance. That's a great insight, Paul. Thank you so much. No, honestly.
I'm an Australian Irish, which means my genre is we do victims and we do saints and rebels. They're like, we do rebels and saints and victims. We do that really well as Irish.
That's lovely. Paul, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And what I take from it is that a story is not what you tell. A story is what happens in between the people, and you can look at it from different angles. And really, I think I knew it before this interview, but now I have a greater insight. So thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I just, to leave people with just a sense of that, when we talk about stories, start also talking about power. Put those two conversations together. And then I think it becomes a different sort of conversation.